Welcome to Modern Latin America in 15 minutes. My name is Dr. Kim Richardson, and today we are going to discuss the meaning of democracy. What I mean by the meaning of democracy in Latin America throughout the 20th century is we're going to start by discussing the Great Depression, 1929, go on to discuss a turn to dictatorships, and then fight the Second World War. After the World War, we're going to turn to the liberation theology as a means of trying to get more freedoms and liberties and welfare for the masses. So we begin with 1929, the stock market crash. Very famous. Latin America found that they could no longer expect to purchase manufactured goods from the United States, and they could no longer expect the United States to purchase their raw goods. So what are they going to do? They turn inward. ISI, import, substitution, industrialization. Yes, we discussed this in lesson 17 on nationalism. But what's key is that now they are turning inward and they're manufacturing their goods. Does that mean, therefore, that it's the end of neocolonialism? They no longer have to depend on the world market or a certain power like the United States in order to buy their goods? Well, most books say, well, yes. But I say, well, no. No, because even though there is a pause of depending on the United States or depending on a neocolonial power, they're going to return to this system afterwards and continue up into the 21st century. That is called the dependency theory. They are economically dependent on another country. Lots of economists have argued one way or the other. I am not an economist, I'm a historian. I do study the economy, and I would argue that it is, indeed, dependency theory seems the most viable to me. Nonetheless, 1929 is the Great Depression. The Great Depression was blamed on the powers in charge. Say, for example, the United States blamed President Hoover for the Great Depression. And then the U.S. citizens, the voters, turned to the Democrats and FDR. Latin America, the same thing. We blamed democracy for causing the Great Depression, and we turned to dictatorships. 1930-ish till the end of World War II then is going to see dictatorships predominate in Latin America. Say, for example, Brazil turned to dictatorships, and in 1934 this is known as the new state, the Estado Novo, under the dictatorship of Getulio Vargas. In 39, World War II starts, but in 1941, the United States is going to come into play, December of 1941, and you would say, okay, well, what does that mean for Latin America? That means a continuation of import substitution industrialization, because they can still not buy manufactured goods from the United States, because all of their the U.S. manufactured goods are going to be used to fight this war. So is it the end of ISI? Not until the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, then you could argue that ISI comes to an end, but not during World War II. Nonetheless, Latin America, beginning with the example of Rio de Janeiro, they meet in January of 1942. That's 1 month after Pearl Harbor, and they decide, well, we're going to have to break off relations with the Axis powers. Now, there's two ways that you could look at this. The United States is way up here, and the farther away from the United States you go, the slower they are to break off diplomatic relations with the Axis powers. That is one reason, the distance from the United States. But the biggest reason is that in Chile and Argentina, they have the greatest number of Italians and German immigrants. And so as a result of that, they're slower to break off relations with them. But they do. All of Latin America then goes and allies with the Allied powers. Two countries, however, physically participate in the Second World War, Mexico and Brazil. Mexico up here, they participate in these two ways. Number one, the Bracero program, especially important for understanding U.S. history, and that is that if so many people in the rural areas are going to the manufacturing areas, who's going to grow the crops, who's going to pick the crops, who's going to work in the rural areas. And the answer is, why don't we invite Mexican laborers across the border to temporarily work in the United States? And they did. And that's called the Bracero program. Brazo is an arm, so it's working kind of arm in arm as this program. But in addition to this, they participate by sending their Air Force to fight in the Pacific Theater, number 2, the Pacific Squadron here, attaching themselves to the United States Air Force. So therefore, they are physically participating in these two ways. They also participate, as does all of Latin America, by manufacturing raw goods that will therefore be used, producing raw goods that will therefore be used to be manufactured in the U.S. factories, especially into different types of war material. Brazil also participated by sending an invasion force to Italy to participate when we're trying to go from Africa to Italy to push back, push the Nazis back into Germany. All of these are two very important aspects here. So Latin America then, here's the point, participates in World War II on the Allied side, either physically or by producing the raw goods. How then can we fight to make the world safe for democracy and still have a dictatorship? The answer is we simply cannot justify it. So we turned in 1945 to a democracy. Latin America, around 1945, overthrows dictatorships and creates democracy. That's a revival of 19th century liberalism, and by this I mean freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, these important freedoms that we hold so important. Take, for example, Brazil. In 1945, they had the Estado Novo. Getulio Vargas is the dictator. The military overthrows Vargas and reinstitutes a democracy. Therefore, come down here, they're going to have elections in 1945, 50, 55, and 60. They're going to write a new constitution in 1946. They turn to democracy after World War II. What I mean by democracy is not just liberalism, is this. Number one, are elections free? And by free, I mean secret, so you can vote for anybody you want to and nobody knows, and uncorruptible. Fair. And that means that you can't stuff the ballot box. So are they free? And number two, does the president leave office at the end of his constitutionally prescribed term? In 1800, Jefferson was elected president of the United States, and FDR turned and left and went home. President Jefferson said, "This is a revolution." No violence occurred, as one party was ousted and another party came in and nobody shot anybody. So therefore, the same thing here. Does that occur throughout Latin America? When one party leaves office, does the other party coming into office come in peacefully? If not, it's not truly a democracy in my book. And if you go to a democracy, does it go to the source of the problems? Does it solve the issue of neocolonialism? Does it solve the issue of land reform? Does it create economic independence? Far and wide, the answer is no. It does not. So therefore, whereas a dictatorship failed to solve some of these problems, so too does a democracy fail to solve some of these problems. One key aspect that focuses, however, on these problems is going to be the Roman Catholic Church. The Church has traditionally been upholder of the status quo. But now, after World War II, they started to demand change. They want to protect the masses. They want to save the body as well as the soul. This begins, no, it doesn't begin. It culminates in the Second Vatican Council. This is a great bishops' meetings and stuff before this, but it's the Second Vatican Council in 1962 to 65, in which it's most obviously seen in the United States as when all of a sudden you stop having a Mass in Latin and you have it in the vernacular languages. Well, it's more than that, but that's one of the most obvious aspects. One key aspect is liberation theology. That is that how are we going to save Jose if Jose is working from dawn to dusk 7 days a week? If he is being, his rights are being abused, how are we going to change society? How are we going to make things better? And they're going to try to do that then through ecclesiastical-based communities. Let me explain how this works in my opinion. First, you have a Bible study group, and you go and say, okay, we're going to study this Bible. You're going to bring the treats, you're going to bring the drinks, and we're going to study this chapter of the Bible. And the priest comes and studies with you, and it's great. The next week, if the priest is a little bit late, you say, hey, priest, where were you? And he says, well, I was with Jose because somebody knocked down Jose's fence. All right. Well, then you have the Bible study. The next week, he comes even a little bit later, but he doesn't even have his clerical garb on. He says, priest, you're late. He says, I'm sorry, but I was trying to help Jose because somebody not only knocked down his fence, but killed all his cattle. Darn it, that's sad. The next week he comes and says, all right, instead of talking about doing good to thy neighbor, why don't we go and help Jose? So all of a sudden you all leave and you start doing work for Jose, rebuilding his fence and stuff. So what you're doing is you're going from just a study group to physically doing something. You might protest, you might demand change, but what you're doing is you're doing something more than simply read the scriptures. You're doing something, liberation theology. Does democracy at this time of liberation theology create programs to abolish poverty, illiteracy, hunger, unemployment? No, it does not. So whereas dictatorship didn't change anything, neither will democracy change anything. It looked like it did. Great superhighways were built. Color TVs were purchased by many of the middle and upper classes. Luxury cars were seen driving on the roads. But for the masses, it did not change anything. I'm reading this great book right now, Child of the Dark by Carolina Maria de Jesus, that discusses at this time a peasant, peasant, living in a favela, a slum, and what it was like. Was anything different for her? No. And this is a collection of her diary entries is what it is. Well, the United States is fighting a Cold War. We care more about the Cold War than anything. So the United States Department declared in early 1964 that it would not distinguish between dictatorships and democracy. Why? Because we say those twin pursuits that we discussed earlier, 64 years earlier in particular, trade and security. That's what we're focusing on. As long as we can protect our trade and security, then we'll be okay. And we can protect that whether it's dictatorship or democracy. In reality, it's easier to protect those two in a dictatorship than a democracy. Democracies are messy people, messy things. So, if in 1945 and 1964, Latin America turned to democracy, in 1964, Latin America turned to dictatorships. Could just be coincidence that it was 64, the same year as that declaration, but I don't think so. Here's a great example. Because democracies failed to solve the problems, and the United States did not care anymore if Latin America was democratic. Brazil in 1945 had overthrown the Estado Novo, the dictatorship, and in 1964 they overthrew democracy. They returned to a dictatorship to try to solve some of these problems. And as you'll see, the dictatorship appeared, they call that the economic miracle, to solve the problem. But the reality is it didn't change anything for the masses. Military believes themselves to be the guardians of nationality. So between 1930 and 1964, for example, militaries continued to overthrow democracies. By 1970, lots of places had turned to military dictatorships in Latin America. Here's a conclusion in the last 30 seconds remaining. In 1930, Latin America was largely democratic. But because of the Great Depression and blaming democracy for the economic problems, many Latin American countries turned to dictatorship during that period. These are just rough estimates, right? Generalities. From 1945-ish, after fighting to make the world safe for democracy, Latin America turned back to a dictatorship. To a democracy. And then in 1964, they turned back to a dictatorship. Democracy, dictatorship, democracy, dictatorship, democracy, and then the current political situation. That is Modern Latin America in 15 minutes.